Welcome to Lecture 5 of the Religions of Israel by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And this week we are going to begin to really talk about how the Israelite religion, or the kind of basic religion that most people followed, was transformed over a period of time to, at least by the authors of most of the biblical texts. We just started. Which doesn't necessarily mean they succeeded in changing the everyday practice, but ultimately there was a huge impact, and it had its biggest impact, you might say, in the Second Temple period, because the texts that were developed, when they become sacred, then become the template for a lot of practice. But again, a lot of old things survive, and I talked last week about how divine fluidity survives in the form of the synagogue. But I wanted to start with a late prophecy from what is known as Second Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is really a collection of prophecies from a variety of different times, only a small part of which are actually from the person we know as the prophet Isaiah. And the whole second half of the book, from chapter 40 on, was written during the Babylonian exile and after the Babylonian exile by, it depends on who you read, either by at least two different people, one being the prophet in the exile and one being prophet post-exile. Hi guys, we just started. Or there could be more, or it was written, in fact, by one person. What I find interesting is that Jewish scholars tend to believe it was one person, and Christian scholars tend to believe it was two or more. Because it was quite possible that the person responsible for the exilic prophecies could have been part of the people who returned. It's quite possible. Anyway, Isaiah 45 has a prophecy addressed to the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, who is referred to as the Lord's anointed, the Mashiach, meaning he is a tool of God to bring salvation to the whole world. And we don't have to look at the whole prophecy. Basically, I want to look at one part of it. Of course, it is a prophecy, so God is speaking through the prophet. And this is an example, to my mind, the best example of where the reformers ended up. Okay, remember, this is exilic, right, or a period done in the exile, but right at the end of the exile, when Cyrus has basically given his proclamation allowing the Jews to return to their land. So, Cal, do you want to read it?
I am the Lord, and there is none else. Besides me there is no God. I engird you, though you have not known me, so that they may know from east to west that there is none but me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things.
This is the strictest form of monotheism expressed in the Tanakh, right? No other God, nothing, no possibility. That doesn't mean there aren't angels, celestial court, but there are no other gods. And even though you, Cyrus, have not known me, I am the universal God, the God of the whole earth. I'm not a localized God, right? There is nobody but me. And here comes a really interesting point. If there are no other gods, and I assume that this prophet also believed there were therefore no demonic powers, I form light and create darkness. I make weal, that's how it's all translated, shalom in Hebrew, and create woe, ra.
They translate shalom as weal.
Yes, and they make a little bit of a thing here, weal and woe. I've never liked that translation, but it means I make... Yeah, that's both, yeah, and also the New Standard, version.
Shalom.
Right, and create woe, ra, which means evil.
It's such an unused word.
Yes, it's a very old-fashioned word. Yes, but the point is, everything comes from God. There are no subordinate powers. This immediately is the whole crux of the theodicy problem. If everything comes from God, good or bad, then people begin saying, so why am I suffering if I'm not a bad person? The rabbis took verse 7,
Right,
and they took the last word ra, and they changed it to hakol, right?
So this is from the Yotzer?
Yes, it's the very first blessing.
I was going to tell people, I don't think, because you have to hear the Hebrew to know.
Right. Yotzer or v'choshech oseh shalom uvorei et hara in the original, or in the Sidur uvorei et hakol. In other words, the rabbis used this verse to form the first blessing before the Shema, the blessing called the Yotzer, which deals with creation, and they couldn't put Ra into the liturgy for, I think, good reasons. So they changed the biblical text.
They changed Ra
to Hakol, to everything. Okay?
So like when the Reform movement changes liturgy, and people say, oh, how could you change what was from hundreds? The rabbis changed the Bible.
Actually, a biblical,
Put
actually
in
changed a biblical text.
Why couldn't they put in a Ra?
Because liturgy is about hope and is about, and by that point also, they were having a lot of trouble with the notion that evil could come from heaven. There was this idea that no evil comes from heaven. The Kabbalists, then you have to figure, well, then why is there evil and what does it mean? Anyway, that's a whole other issue. But what?
They changed it to Hakol.
They changed it to Hakol. But this is this is a personal opinion of mine, one of the strictest and strongest expressions of monotheism. And since this is right at the beginning of the Second Temple period, or just before the rebuilding of the temple, this shows you where things ended up.
So you said this was after they were allowed to return.
Well, at least after the proclamation. The prophet has probably not yet gone back yet.
Okay, but it was after.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
so the fulfillment of the prophecy
is coming true. Yes, Jeremiah's prophecy is about to come true. And here you see the completely universal God, no other God. Cyrus the Great is, God anointed him emperor of the Persians, in effect, and Cyrus is the instrument of God's will. Now, it's not the first time that the idea of a foreign ruler being the instrument of God's will, but notice, I ingird you, though you have not known me. I am God, even though you don't know it. Right?
So this comes from Isaiah.
Comes from, no, not from the prophet Isaiah, from the unknown prophet whose works were attached to the book of Isaiah.
So when you say this is where things end up,
yeah.
Do you mean by that, you think that at the time when this is being preached, this is where the Jewish people were at, or is this Isaiah sort of giving his view? The others weren't there yet, but eventually they get there.
Well, this is where the process of Reformation or Revolution has ended up, right? This is the 6th century BCE, right? The process goes further for a variety of ways till, the Torah is officially published in the 5th century, but this is a process that begins in the 8th century, actually the 9th century BCE, and that's what we're going to look at today.
But I was just asking more on the time. Like you said, this is where the theology ends up.
Yeah. Well, but when the second, when the Second Temple is rebuilt, it pretty much by that point follows this theology, right? Only one temple, no shrines, all kinds of other things.
There was a big, and I don't know, prolonged conflict between the people, different people.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, that it's not 100%, but this is the beginning of the real transition from Israelite religion to Judaism. Okay, all right. So
you're saying this is the kind of the fulcrum where it goes from.
Yeah. Everything we've been talking for up until now, what the average Israelite did, what they believed, the idea that there could be subordinate gods, that they could use fetishes, that they had multiple shrines, that God could be manifest in a stele, all these kinds of things that we know from the earlier sources and from archaeology, all that stuff is rejected. Okay, but that's a process, and Jordan's right. Look, it's never perfect. Again, it's the difference between what's written in the book versus what people actually do. And we know that people continue to believe in demons. But the fact is that this becomes, you might say, the official ideology. Right?
Any hypothesis about who this individual might have been?
Somebody who was born in Babylon and then came back. If we follow the Jewish scholars, it was somebody who was born during the Babylonian exile and came back to Judea with the return.
I'm a simple person, Rabbi.
I don't know. We don't know. We don't know. Somebody who was someone who was very much part of the Reform party of the people who produced Deuteronomy and all that kind of stuff.
Could it have been Ezra, or was it after?
No, it's not Ezra. It's too early for Ezra. It's too early for Ezra. Ezra comes later.
6th century BCE.
This is written around 500 or so.
And then when does it get incorporated
Into the Bible?
Into the Bible and into the book of Isaiah?
Well, that's hard to say, but very likely by around 200 BCE. In other words, the Torah we know is pretty much in the form the way we have it now by around 450 BCE, and we know that the prophets very likely are assembled and edited by around 200, probably also the book of Psalms, and then the rest of the Hebrew Bible subsequently to that. Okay?
So I'm going to kind of...
I don't want to spend too much more time on this, by the way.
Okay. Well, this is sort of the overall question. You feel free to say.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
But do you see this kind of moment more as revolution or as evolution? Because I'm hearing you say more evolution, but part of me wants to say revolution.
Depends on how you define it. You could see it as evolution, or you could see it as revolution. I'm leaning more towards the notion of a radical break with the past. Okay.
See, the exile and the return.
But it happens a lot. You see, there's an evolution that occurs before. I mean, how can you call something a revolution that happens over 300 years, right? Okay. Basically, there is a certain evolution. On the other hand, it is a radical break with the past. Okay? Okay, so at the end of last time, I gave you very quickly the characteristic of where we end up, but I want to do it in a little more detail, so it was a little quick. So here are the 7 chief characteristics of where we end up.
Meaning, at this point, with this kind of theology.
Yeah. Okay, and again, this is already happening earlier than that in many circles, in the priestly and prophetic circles. This is what's already happening. So first of all, you get a stricter monotheism. God is unique and one, right? Which you see in Deuteronomy with the Shema and other texts. There's an active polemic against idolatry, which you don't see as much in the early texts. This is in Deuteronomy, this is in Jeremiah, this is in 2nd Isaiah. There are some bitter, sarcastic attacks on the worship of idols in 2nd Isaiah, as if they are fetishes. This is what it is. Other religions are fetishism because they worship images of wood and stone. In other words, they're intentionally mischaracterizing the religions of the other nations as being fetish, not, thinking that the stone is God. There's some wonderful satirical sections in 2nd Isaiah, some of which show up as Haftarot, where he sarcastically says a guy buys a log of wood, he cuts it in half, he makes an idol out of one half, he uses the other half to cook his dinner, and then he prays to the half that he's carved. It's great stuff. Okay, so that's the whole point. A much stricter monotheism than we had before. Secondly, a centralization of worship. There's only one legitimate site of sacrifice, and that's the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this centralization went through probably 2 stages. Very likely, originally, what happened is that during the time of Hezekiah, at the end of the 8th century BCE, Hezekiah didn't shut down all the local shrines, but he stopped having them do animal sacrifice and restricted their sacrifice to meal offerings and incense. That's one theory. But Josiah, one of the last kings of Judah, in the late 7th century BC, he shuts everything down, knocks them down. We have archaeological evidence for that, right? That's the end of the local shrines. Number 3, myth versus history. Myth is a slippery term. it's not a question of myth or no myth, but which myth you believe in. But the myths that we're talking about here are the great themes of the combat theologies of the creation combat theologies, where God is fighting the serpents and chaos as the primordial deep and all that stuff. That stuff gets really de-emphasized. And a perfect example is Genesis 1. Look at the creation story in Genesis 1. Creation by speech without opposition. There are little hints of the mythology behind it, but they've basically been neutered, and there are no opposition forces to God. God doesn't even have to work hard, right? And again, you see that evolving. It doesn't happen all at once. Secondly, there's a blend of the mythic and history in the idea that historical events are in cyclical patterns. So I'll give you one example. The story of Joseph is a magnificent literary creation. It's a novella in many ways, but it's no doubt the intention of the author of that story that the rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall of Joseph is meant to stand for the rise and fall in Israel. And the idea being that at the end, it stays up, right? And that's why it probably has, final form is probably exilic as a message of hope, right? Another, you see often in 2nd Isaiah, and that he compares the return from Babylon to a second Exodus. That is, the theme of the Exodus becomes a template for the return from the Babylonian exile. And of course, in Judaism, the Exodus becomes a significant template for all of subsequent Jewish history. So there's a sense of the mythic, because it's a cyclical return. On the other hand, it is an attempt to historicize it, right? In other words, the emphasis is on what's called the salvation history, the Exodus from Egypt and the conquest of Canaan. That becomes, if you look in Deuteronomy, that becomes the critical point.
So you're saying that it's history and not myth?
Well, not the classic myths, but the way history is used itself is a kind of myth. Do you know what I mean? A myth is a story of explanation, a story that people says that shapes their outlook on the world. So the Exodus has become the Jewish story, right? And you see that going all the way back to Deuteronomy.
You're using Gilman's.
Yeah, Gilman's definition of myth, right?
Which is not.
Well, that's not the common understanding
sort
of myth.
Construct.
Well, it's from anthropology essentially. Okay, I mean you see it in other ways where the festivals of Passover and Shavuot and Sukkot are detached from their original agricultural roots and their use as creation festivals and fertility festivals, and they are directly connected with the Exodus to this very day, right? Mostly we see them as being created because they are aspects of the Exodus story.
The agricultural part is the cyclic.
But
the historic part is anti-cyclic.
Yeah, I know, and what I'm saying is the underlying pre-history stuff never completely goes away. It's all a question of emphasis, right? Okay. By the way, the other thing about the centralization of worship is there's a certain de-emphasis on if you look in Deuteronomy, for example, there's a de-emphasis of sacrifice. There's a de-emphasis of the idea of the sacred in the way that the priestly theology does. And as you will see, one of the most important things is the Deuteronomic people don't believe God's presence lives in the temple, only in heaven. In other words, the Deuteronomy people, I would add a point to this, is that there is a higher sense of God as transcendent as opposed to immanent on the earth. We'll look at that more closely when we look at Deuteronomy, but the Deuteronomic people don't believe that God actually lives in the temple. God has a heavenly temple, okay? Number 3, individualism. This is, yes, Robert?
The problem I'm having, Rabbi, is your statement of de-emphasis
on
mythological themes. From what I understand from what you've been saying, it's not de-emphasis, it is changing myth into history.
Yeah, but it's history in a mythic form. All right, there's no such thing as no myth. It's just you change your myth from this creation theology to a historical event. Okay? It's all myth. It's all a question of what kind of myth it is. All right?
So all the news that's fit to print, is it in itself a myth? No, there is no such thing as just the facts. You have to turn it into a storyline, and once you make it a storyline, it's a myth on some level, if it gets adhered to and kind of followed as like a pattern or something.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is I don't think it's de-emphasis of mythical themes. I think it is saying the myth is a fact, and therefore accepted, it becomes our history.
Well, you know what I'm saying is that the myth, the underlying myths of the chaos and the serpents, it never completely goes away. And by the way, it never goes away. It gets transformed in the Second Temple period, ultimately into apocalyptic literature. So it never completely goes away. It's really downplayed in the Torah. It's scoured out of large parts of the Torah, that's why you only see it surviving in places like Job or the Psalms.
Perhaps you mean the emphasis of some mythological themes.
Well, maybe if you want to put it that way. It's a change of what the myth is. Okay,
the ancient myths were turned into.
Yeah, right. Individualism. This is where there is a change of spiritual emphasis from the identity defined in the matrix of family, clan, tribe, and nation. In other words, there was no sense of an individual qua individual. You were completely within this matrix, both during and after your life. And because of that, the notion of cross-generational punishment as found in the Ten Commandments is completely understandable, right? What you have is a change to the notion of individual responsibility. It's in Jeremiah, but most clearly in Ezekiel 18, where in effect says nobody gets punished for other people's sins, only their own. That's an explicit rejection of the Ten Commandments in Exodus. Okay? There is a more elevation in the status of women in this when you have individualism, and the nation now becomes a community of committed believers. There's a shift here from this notion of what we might call an indigenous nation approach, where there is an intricate matrix between the people, the land, and God, to a group who are more in the sense of what we call a faith community. And even the term for the nations change from kind of national terms to Edah Kahal, which is very different than Am or Goy, right? So it's shifting the definition of the nation to what we will call more of a religious definition as opposed to a religious/national definition.
Are we going to go through this in more detail?
Well, you're going to see how it plays out in the various things.
Because elevation of status of woman and you walk away from it. I mean, give us an example.
Well, when you look at the law codes in Deuteronomy, there's definitely a move away from. I mean, it's not like today, but it's because you emphasize the individual, you're moving away slightly from the slightly away from a woman as being intimate. Just basically a part of the family. And under the complete control of the father or husband, to something where there is more granted a sense of individual status to that. Okay?
What is your path? Where are you going from where to where here?
What do you mean? Well, from what was before. Where we've been talking about for the last 4 weeks.
Can you remind me where you're going from your ruler?
Well, you mean the timeline?
Yeah.
We're getting to that. The individualism is also expressions of one's individual's relationship to God and inward spirituality. Okay? You see this in the Psalms. You see this in the idea of the love of God, right? The first paragraph of the Shema, you shall love the Lord your God. It's only in Deuteronomy that the concept of the love of God is expressed in the Torah. Never says in the earlier books you have to love God. You've got to respect God, you've got to obey God, you try to be holy like God, but only in Deuteronomy it says you have to love God. Okay? And because of that, the problem of evil and suffering of the individual, not the nation, comes to the fore. Right? When you have this stricter monotheism, as I'm repeating what I said earlier, the idea that God is the source of everything produces the theodicy problem. If God is the source of everything, why am I suffering? And why are evil people getting away with murder and good people, righteous people, are suffering? So you see that in Jeremiah. You see that in the book of Job.
But if God creates everything, then God creates evil. I don't think they solved the problem by
But
saying
no, but
it's
before that, people could explain evil by demons that have nothing to do with God. Yes, God could punish the nation.
So God created the demon.
But also collective punishment is horrific in our minds.
Right, but collective punishment.
It's much easier theologically.
Well, yeah, in other words, I'm suffering not because of what I did, but because of the nation, because of what my ancestors did, or because of demons. Now, if there are no demons and I am only suffering for my own sins, then I must have done something wrong. But what was it? Okay?
Right. By the way, it's a individual reward and punishment is a very difficult concept for us.
It's very
Group
difficult.
Is not as difficult.
Yeah, I know.
And it's it's important, say, Jewish environmentalism, which you
Right. But the point is the notion of the individual reward and punishment becomes a very big area of discussion from this point until the Holocaust. Right? Okay? It is a major theme in Jewish religious literature. Like if you do a history of the Jewish responses to evil and suffering, it's post-biblical. It's really look, the national stuff never completely goes away, like many things, but the emphasis is really on the individual. Why did I get sick? Why did my child die? Okay? All right, the other big thing that emerges is the notion of the religion as being a text religion and having a canon, meaning a body of literature that is considered sacred, God-given, because previously most forms of Israelite religion were oral. And if they wrote stuff down, they were, writing it down for purposes of, like the priests probably had, a bunch of stuff they wrote down on how to do various sacrifices, sort of manuals, right? But now you get a text-centeredness and the need to preserve an immutable canon. You see this in the book of Deuteronomy. Don't change anything, it says. You're not allowed to change this. Okay? And what you see is the beginning of the idea of codification and standardization. It's a process that would eventually produce the whole Hebrew Bible from the 5th century BCE to the 1st century CE. In other words, it's 6 centuries process, stage by stage. And the other thing that emerges when you begin to have a sacred canon, you begin to see later sources commenting and interpreting earlier sources. And there are numerous examples of that. Deuteronomy commenting on things in Exodus. Some things in Leviticus may be a response to Deuteronomy. Stuff in the later texts that are like Ecclesiastes talking about Psalm 8. There are allusions to the Joseph story and the story of David. There's all kinds of ways in which it's what scholars call intertextuality, or pre-rabbinic midrash, if you want to call it that. All right? Okay, number 6, new forms of piety. Study becomes a form of piety. Prayer becomes a central, prayer, existed in previous times, but prayer comes up to be a lot more important as an expression of personal piety. There's less emphasis on ritual.
But sacrifice continues at this time.
But only in one place. That's a big de-emphasis on sacrifice, right? And
so the so-called synagogue hadn't come into being.
The synagogue starts in the diaspora. There's a big, we don't know exactly when, but the theology of the synagogue comes into play right after the destruction of the first temple. The idea that prayer can replace sacrifice and that you can do it anywhere in the world. You don't have to be in the Holy Land, right? Because before that, the indigenous religion said the only place you can be an Israelite and a worshiper of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is in his land, right? Now, you're sitting in Babylon. If I pray towards the ruins of city of Jerusalem, that is as good as a sacrifice. There's plain textual evidence for that.
But item number 2, the centralization of worship is different from that.
Well, no, the idea is that when we can rebuild the temple, we want to rebuild the temple, we want to start the sacrificial service, but there's only one place. So yeah, the highest level of attachment to God is through sacrifice at God's holy temple, but you know what? If I'm living in Egypt, you know, the Greek-speaking community, my prayers will be accepted.
So it says shutting down of local shrines. They weren't all shut down.
They were shut down. The synagogue is I'm talking about shrines like we talked about where there are sacrifices done. But the local temples, shrine I don't mean synagogue, local temples and the bamot. Okay?
So when sacrifice was limited to the temple in Jerusalem,
yeah,
that was in effect kind of ritualizing sacrifice and removing it as such a central theme.
No, it wasn't ritualizing. It was all ritual. The sacrifice was the central form of worship.
What was making it?
Well, it was making it inaccessible for large numbers of people.
But inaccessible.
Yeah, because you used to be, if you wanted to do a sin offering, you went to your local shrine. Now you have to schlep to Jerusalem. You may live in the Galilee, right?
So it sounds like it becomes less of a part of one's regular life.
Yeah, and the religion adapts so that you can do certain things locally that you could only do before at a centralized shrine, like slaughter animals for food. Because before, when you wanted to slaughter an animal for food, you had to do it at a shrine. Every slaughter of an animal was a form of sacrifice. Now, you can have secular slaughter.
But it sounds like a de-emphasis of sacrifice.
Well,
Sacrifice is only something which is...
Yeah, I mean, it really cuts down the number of sacrifices, absolutely.
Sure, and it makes it just part of a ritual, as opposed to a regular thing that's...
Well,
maybe ritual
I don't want to...
isn't the right word.
Yeah, the ritual isn't the right word. What it does is it makes Jerusalem the most holy spot in the entire world. It raises the importance of the temple in Jerusalem. It raises importance of the city of Jerusalem, but it also leaves a spiritual gap. And that becomes even more so when there's a diaspora, right? When you have a large number of Jews living in Babylon, when a community emerges in Greece, in Egypt, and in Syria. How are you going to, get rid of your sin, which required before a sacrifice? So the synagogue emerges. Again, the synagogue has its own complex history. So what emerges is a form of spirituality where prayer can replace sacrifice, even though you'd rather go to Jerusalem, and people do go on pilgrimage, and that's like the Hajj, it's a real big deal if in your lifetime you can go to Jerusalem, but you can have a perfectly good Jewish spiritual life sitting in Alexandria if you want, praying and studying. Yeah, Robert?
I see a paradox. As far as I can see, the Kohanim, the Aaronite line, wanted to centralize everything in Jerusalem.
It wasn't them.
Who was it then?
It was the Deuteronomic people. That's different.
But it wasn't...
Well, yeah, they restricted the priesthood to the Aaronite line, but I can't say it's the Aaronites' fault. I'm saying it's the Deuteronomic people, who is a much bigger group.
And the paradox was, having attempted to get this power grab, in order for the Jews to survive, the rabbinate rose up, the diaspora rose up.
The rabbinate is much, much later. Much, much later.
But it's a consequence of a power grab to Jerusalem.
Well, you see, you can just... It's not... No, you're looking at it strictly in political terms. It's a religious revolution for a variety of reasons. It's not a political power grab. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Maccabean revolt was an internal...
Yeah, the Maccabean revolt. Yeah, let's not get into that, because that caused a whole other problem with the office of the high priesthood, because it passed out of the line of Zadok. Right. All right, so that who is descendant of Aaron.
They were priests.
Yeah, that's one of the causes of sectarianism. Anyway, let's leave that. One of the other thing is that the older liturgical tradition is revised to be compatible with stricter monotheism. And the last one is, you have to understand that what is going on in Judea, because ultimately this is where most of it happens.
Expand on that last sentence.
Well, you get the really old prayers of the Psalms, and you get them incorporated. You get material that is very much part of that earlier thing, incorporated, reinterpreted, edited, slightly changed. In other words, there's a lot of old liturgical material in the Bible, but it's incorporated now within a stricter monotheistic form, like the Song at the Sea, right? Chapter 15 of Exodus, yeah.
I had always understood that with the destruction of the temple,
Yeah.
The synagogue rose and essentially saved the Jewish religion.
Yeah, well, we
But
don't
now,
know. Yeah.
I see from what you're saying is that something similar happened much earlier with the exile.
Yes.
And if that had not happened, if they had not been able to come to find some way to worship, then it would have died out.
Yeah, look what happened
back
to and look what happened to the northern tribes. That's exactly what happened to the northern tribes.
So it's a sort of the same thing.
What happened to the
again?
northern
What do you
tribes?
mean?
The northern tribes who got exiled to Assyria disappeared.
They disappeared.
The Judeans survived as a distinct group.
In Babylon.
Yeah.
Because
They were able to have portable holiness. They were able to worship their God outside the land of Israel, retain their identity,
Why didn't the
decentralize their religion. I mean,
they didn't, and the northern tribes just didn't have a leader who was pliable.
well, no, they just, for their own particular reason, part of which was the instability of the dynasties and a whole variety of reasons. But the fact is, and as you will see, though, a significant number of the northern tribes ended up moving south. A large part of the northern population moved south into the Judean and mixed. So we are all a mixture of a lot of different tribes, by the way. We really are. There's no doubt about it. Okay?
But it could also have to do with this.
Yeah, well,
because the northern kingdom was defeated so much earlier.
Yeah.
This whole change had
absolutely.
happened, and because what you described with the different, steles and that kind of worship wasn't far enough away, perhaps, from what was going on in Assyria.
Well,
and
yeah.
therefore, they probably said, "Well, we'll have a tree."
And in fact,
right?
in fact, it was precisely the destruction of the northern kingdom that set off the reform. Okay? It started earlier in the north. The whole reform started in the north, as you will see. But the cap of it was, when the north is destroyed, the prophets were vindicated into what they were all doing wrong. So that it really is believed that the Deuteronomic people had their roots in the north. Okay? So in fact, it was a northern ideology that came down and captured the ideology of the Judeans.
The north were destroyed and went to Assyria.
They were
the south were destroyed. How much later and went to
150
Babylon?
years.
So 150 years after the north had been destroyed,
yeah,
the Babylonians came in.
Yeah.
You know me, Rabbi, I'm always looking for a name. Because, Henry Kissinger once said he was always surprised that there was an individual who was able to...
No, there's no individual we to point to. The point is, you see it in Jeremiah, you see it in Ezekiel, you see it in Deuteronomy. There is obviously several groups there that you've got the P people, you've got the D people, and the P people are probably more of the establishment, but even they're a reforming group, and they're the ones who bring the JE material into create what we would call the proto-Torah of the first 4 books. But the D people have their own book, which is Deuteronomy, and sometime in the Babylonian exile, they all got together and created a coalition, essentially.
So you've said it's Jeremiah and it's Ezekiel.
Well, and the whole D school, most of whom we don't know who they were. But there's no doubt about the fact that there are northern roots to this and the destruction of the northern kingdom. Let's move on because we're going to get to all that. What I want to do is talk about the last part here. What's going on as part of the general cultural context of the ancient Near East from 800 to 400 BCE. First of all, you have development of a totally new political organization in the ancient Near East, the empire. The Neo-Assyrians created the first empire of the ancient Near East. It was followed by the Neo-Babylonians and then the Persians. So first of all, you have this large-scale a ruling of one nation over many, many other nations of a way that didn't exist before. Okay, so that's a very important part. That's the background to everything that we're talking about. In addition, these empires created what we call imperial religions. The god of the state had supremacy over other gods. It's not monotheism, it's imperial religion. But part of this stricter monotheism is a counter to that, is an attack on that, right? What you have is a mixing of populations through exile and resettlement, which weakened a lot of the old religions, right? And you get syncretization and all kinds of things going on. And lastly, it creates a huge amount of uncertainty, which means in many of these nations, there's a certain, paradoxically, there's a kind of conservatism where religious and cultural focus on ancient traditions and the desire to present the new as authentically old. The Deuteronomic people had to show that their book was written by Moses, right? And so there are documents that have claimed to have been written by ancient sages. That happens throughout the ancient Near East, and therefore the Deuteronomic peoples claim that what they have goes back to Moses is just part of a general cultural context when people were doing this. It's a way of producing authenticity. Okay? All right. So I gave you this map again. I gave you this map again just so, sorry for the tiny form, but I'm trying to save paper, which you got in a bigger form in the first class, just to give you an idea of where we are from 800. The kingdom of Israel is much bigger than the kingdom of Judah, you have to understand. And the biggest nation that was a problem for the northern kingdom was the kingdom of Aram Damascus. There was almost constant warfare between Israel and Aram Damascus. Sometimes the Judeans were allied with the northern kingdom, and sometimes they were not. But then you had the kingdom of Ammon and the kingdom of Moab, who sometimes were under domination by Judea or Israel, and sometimes they, proclaim their independence. You have the Philistines and you have the Phoenicians, who are just another form of Canaanite, okay? So these are the minor nations that exist in this area that are caught between the Mesopotamian empires of Assyria and later Babylon and Egypt, right? And Egypt is always trying to play power politics with these nations to ward off invasion by these Mesopotamian empires. And the Mesopotamian empires are always trying to come down and control these nations so they can go attack Egypt, right? And there are periods of time when they control Egypt and other times when they don't. It's the Persians who sort of completely end that and completely control what's going on in this area until Alexander the Great comes. Okay, so if you look at page 3, sorry this is not clearer. I really had a lot of trouble finding a chart that said everything I wanted. But if you look at the top half of each of the two columns, you see here the kings of Israel and the prophets and when they lived in relation to them. This is going to be important. Okay? Take a look where it says Omri. Omri is the founding of first of all, every time you see a break, the northern kingdom has numerous dynasties. There's no single dynasty that dominates its entire history. You have Jeroboam, who's the one who initiated the break after the death of Solomon, but then you have new ones. And then with Omri, you have a 4-generation dynasty, from Omri to Ahab to Azariah to Joram. And then there's a coup, and Jehu takes place, and then it's essentially a series of short-term dynasties. The longest king in the north is Jeroboam II, and that's when it reaches its most powerful, largest geographically, most powerful, its wealthiest, but at the end of his reign, everything just completely collapses. You'll see there's a whole series of kings who follow. There are political assassinations and domination by the Assyrians until finally the Assyrians just come in and destroy the place.
Explain the chart us a little bit better. The upper panel is
the kings of Israel and the prophets who prophesied in the north.
So the upper panel is north.
Yeah, and the southern panel is south. as some of the dates of the prophets are a little, not 100%, but this is pretty good. So you see that Elijah and Elisha are, Elijah...
The problem, well, I'm sorry, because in each of them, the upper panel is north and the lower panel is
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the lower panel, there is no north.
Got you.
Right. The point is, you see Elijah is during the time of Ahab, and then Elisha takes over, and Elisha is actually around for quite a long time. There's a guy in the book of Second Kings called Jonah ben Amittai, who was probably the model for the guy in the book of Jonah. And then you have, you notice at the end of Jeroboam II, you have Amos and Hosea, and in the south, you have Isaiah and Micah. Now, putting the Obadiah and Joel further on, that's very speculative. We really don't know when Obadiah and Joel preached.
The north go off to Assyria.
Yeah, the whole north is completely absorbed, becomes a province, instead of a vassal kingdom, it becomes directly ruled by the Assyrians, and the entire upper level of the population is carted off.
And they bring the Assyrians in.
Yes, they bring in they bring in people, all kinds of people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire to settle in there, and they end up mixing with the people who are left and end up with a syncretic religion, which ultimately evolves into the Samaritans, by the way. So this just gives you a sense of the prophets. Okay?
Is it possible, because you're not sure of where Obadiah and Joel were, that the prophecy was really a northern thing, by and large? And
could be. I mean, look at most of the prophets are active in the north. I mean, it doesn't mean there weren't prophets. These are just the ones whose books survived,
know about, right?
Or the stories of Elijah and Elisha, right? Okay, we don't have books of Elijah and Elisha. We have stories about them. But there probably were many, many more prophets. I mean, we know the existence of prophets. Well, yeah, Samuel I haven't put in here because that's before the division of the kingdom. But there are lots of prophets. There's lots of different kinds of prophets. These are the ones who are pretty well independent of any kind of political or ritual structure, who are outside critics of what's going on in society, right? Even though sometimes they had access to like Isaiah definitely had access to the royal court. He may have been related to the royal family, but the others are all outsiders.
And Rabbi, the Babylonian exile was from 630 BCE or before then?
586.
586.
Okay.
Until?
Well, until about 500, 70 years later.
You know, I know that you and I have discussed this in the past and you disagree with it, but Friedman has said that he thought Jeremiah was to a large extent responsible for Deuteronomy. And he straddles the Babylonian exile.
Well, he doesn't go into Babylon exile. He goes to Egypt. He lives through the destruction of Jerusalem and ends up, and he writes, don't forget, the Babylonian exile occurred in stages. There were 3 stages of the Babylonians taking people to Babylon, okay? So he's alive during this time. He's a very critical person in the whole Deuteronomic thing, but he wasn't the originator of it. It goes before him, because he was, during the time of Josiah, he's just a young man. He hasn't started prophesying yet. And the book of Deuteronomy, the original draft of it, was discovered, before Jeremiah started prophesying. But there's no doubt he's part of that school. Absolutely. Okay, look at page 4. So, we're going to get to, these are what we're going to look at today. But I just wanted you see that I've given you a list of the Assyrian kings who are relevant to all of this. If there's gaps, that's because I didn't put in a minor thing. Because what happens is the Assyrians begin to emerge in the 9th century BCE as a major power again. They had been centuries before a power, but they had declined. But in the 9th century, they begin to emerge again as a major power in the ancient Near East. And it's under these kings that you have invasions of the Western Asia, okay? And it's under Shalmaneser and Sargon that the northern kingdom gets destroyed, right? Shalmaneser V starts the siege of Samaria, he dies, and then Sargon II completes it. And Sennacherib, who follows Sargon II, is the one who almost destroys Judea in the time of Hezekiah, reduces it essentially to a city-state around Jerusalem. One of the proofs for the immigration of large numbers of northerners to the south is taken from archaeology. Okay, around 700 BCE, during the time of Hezekiah and his son Manasseh, the population of Jerusalem jumps from 6,000 to 8,000 people to 24,000 people. And they do this by measuring the size of the city and assuming a certain density. In other words, there's a certain density that can be estimated. So if you take a look at the picture here, the area called the Temple Mount and the city of David, that was the original Jerusalem until the time of Hezekiah. And then what you have is this. Now, it doesn't mean that people weren't living outside the walls, but during the time of Hezekiah and his son, they build this huge wall called the Broad Wall. This covers what we call today the Jewish Quarter and Mount Zion. They have found pieces of this wall. Okay? It's a massive, massive wall. And the only reason why it's there is to protect an expanded population.
But this wall is built before or after Sennacherib comes in.
This is built before.
So he was anticipating.
Well, he was trying to break away from Assyrian domination. That's why Sennacherib invaded. In other words, he builds the water tunnel. In fact, a lot of the other Judean towns are fortified. Local villages are abandoned. People move into larger fortified centers. So he was preparing for the war.
That's when this was built, but also you think because northern people had come down because there were just more people.
There's no doubt about that. Other Judean settlements were also expanded, and you cannot explain this by natural population increase. It had to be by immigration, okay, and resettlement. It's impossible. If you want to see what it looks like relative to the city today, if you look at the next page, you will see its relationship to the modern Temple Mount and the walls.
So you're using on page 4, this is evidence for emigration.
Yes.
Probably from the north.
Has to be from the north. Has to be from the north. Some of it may be from the hinterlands, Judeans moving in, but the fact is it's too massive to be explained by internal immigration. Right? And it's those northerners who bring south the ideology of what becomes Deuteronomy, right? Starting from Hezekiah. And we have proof of this in the text of the Bible itself and from archaeology. So let's look at this through the text. So we begin in the 9th century BCE with Elijah and Elisha. Now, some people call this the Yahweh First Party, meaning a stricter group of monotheists. Because remember, in the north, during the time of King Ahab, his wife is a Phoenician, Jezebel, who starts bringing in Canaanite, Phoenician/Canaanite worship.
Where you have the list of the
Yeah, look at 1 Kings 16.
Where are you in the
For
handout?
number 2 up here.
Not on page 4.
Page 4 at the top.
Yeah. Look at page 6.
Page 754.
Yeah, 754. This is when Elisha begins. Yeah, it's actually 756. 755. Elisha helps to bring about a coup against the house of Omri, Ahab's son. All right, but what's the point is not about the. Oh, I made a mistake there. Look, it's yeah. Okay, so really, this is actually about God, did I put? No, this is right. This is about Ahab's rule. So
Your number 29.
On 755, if you take a look, Omri does it, and then look what it says. 29. Let's start with 29. Suzanne, you want to start reading it?
Ahab, son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa of Judah. And Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria for 22 years. Ahab son of Omri did what was displeasing to the Lord more than all who preceded him. Not content to follow the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, he took as wife Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Phoenicians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made a sacred post. Ahab did more to vex the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel who preceded
Now,
him.
this, of course, is an editorial comment by the editors of these books, right, who are working from 3 or 4 earlier sources, but this is the editorial opinion of the Deuteronomic people. But notice what it says. He marries a Phoenician princess, and notice it's worse than what did Jeroboam do? Jeroboam created local shrines, which actually existed, to replace the temple in Jerusalem. But what does Ahab do? He goes much further. It's not that he doesn't shut down local shrines or he allows people to worship God. He creates a actual temple to a foreign god in his capital. So he becomes the worst. And notice it's Jezebel who is kind of one of the reasons for this. If you turn to chapter 18, 4 on page 758, it talks about Jezebel killing off the prophets of the Lord. So let's assume for a moment that this is true. She was not only trying to promote her religion, according to this, in which Ahab was acquiescent, she was trying to suppress the worship of Yud-He-Vav-He. Now, whether this is true or not, we don't know, but evidently there is this real struggle going on in the north over who is going to be the God of the kingdom of Israel. So now go down to verse 33, which is on page 760.
And you would put this in the context of like what was going on in Assyria, where you had royal kind of religions, and he was like bringing in his own royal religion, as opposed to the local Yud-He-Vav-He.
Yeah, exactly. But all right, so look at verse 36 at the bottom of 760. Suzanne, you want to read it there? This is the famous contest between Elijah and the priests of Baal. Okay.
When it was time to present the meal offering, the prophet Elijah came forward and said, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, for you have turned their hearts backward. Then fire from the Lord descended and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the earth, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. When they saw this, all the people flung themselves on their faces and cried out, The Lord alone is God, the Lord alone is God.
Adonai hu Elohim. We use that in the Yom Kippur liturgy at Nila. Go on.
Then Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, let not a single one of them get away. They seized them, and Elijah took them down to the Wadi Kishon and slaughtered them there.
Okay, so this is a real fight going on. Okay? These are stories that are edited much later, but nonetheless, they really reflect the struggle that was going on in the north in the 9th century, in which Elijah and his disciple Elisha are in the thick of it. All right, so now go to chapter 20. Verse 28, which is on page 766. This has to do with a battle going on against the king of Aram and a guy named Ben-Hadad, and again reflects this whole fight that's going on. But notice verse 28. Then the man of God, there is a prophet who is there, approached and spoke to the king of Israel. Thus said the Lord, because the Arameans have said, and that's on the previous page, the Lord is a God of mountains, but he is not a God of lowlands. I will deliver that great host into your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. In other words, this again is the rejection of the idea that God is only a localized God, and that God is the real God. Again, this struggle that's going on. Go to chapter
What
20.
does lowland mean?
Well, valleys. He's a god. He's a mountain god. He's not a valley god. So if we fight them in the valley, their god is powerless, right? And the prophet says, "Oh yeah." All right. Look at on page 768, 769. This is again Elijah. Elijah is the thorn in the side of Ahab his whole life. George, you want to start reading verse 20?
Ahab said to Elijah, So you have found me, my enemy. Yes, I have found you, he replied, because you have committed yourself to doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord. I will bring disaster upon you. I will make a clean sweep of you. I will cut off from Israel every male belonging to Ahab, bond and free. And I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of
Previous dynasties.
because of the provocation you have caused by leading Israel to sin. And the Lord has also spoken concerning Jezebel. The dog shall devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel. All of Ahab's line who die in the town shall be devoured by dogs, and all who die in the open country shall be devoured by the
worst thing that could happen to you. No proper burial. Your body is eaten by animals. Read on.
Indeed, there never was anyone like Ahab, who committed himself to doing what was displeasing to the Lord at the instigation of his wife Jezebel. He acted most abominably, straying after the fetishes just like the Amorites, whom the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites.
Okay, then that's an editorial comment, but a reflection of the ideology of Elijah. Now, Elisha, of course, takes over for him, and if you go to 2 Kings chapter 9, again, there's lots of stories here. I'm just giving you a few selections. Go to 9, just the beginning of 9. 795. George, you want to pick it up there?
Then the prophet Elisha summoned one of the disciples of the prophet.
Now you have to understand, Elisha had a band of supporters. Again, the early prophets traveled in bands. Elisha evidently sometimes went with them and sometimes he didn't. But there were bands of these prophets, so that's what it means when it says one of the disciples of the prophets. Go on.
And said to him, Tie up your skirts and take along this flask of oil and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive there, go and see Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Get him to leave his comrades and take him into an inner room. Then take the flask of oil and pour some on his head, and say, Thus said the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee without.
Now, Jehu is one of the generals in the army of the north. King Joram is the son of Ahab, and Jehu is one of his generals. And this is a stealth
coup.
Stealth. Well, it is a stealth coronation which leads to a coup. Like, anoint him and then get the hell out of there. Okay? So now let's see what happens.
The young man, the servant of the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. When he arrived, the army commanders were sitting together. He said, Commander, I have a message for you. For which one of us? Jehu asked. He answered, For you, Commander. So Jehu arose and went inside, and the disciple poured the oil on his head and said to them, Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. You shall strike down the house of Ahab, your master. Thus will I avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants and the prophets, the blood of the other servants of the Lord. The whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off every male belonging to Ahab, bond and free in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah. The dog shall devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel, and none to bury her. With none to bury her.
Yeah.
And he opened the door and fled. Jehu went to the other officers of his master, and they asked him, Is all well? What did that madman come to you for? He said to them, You know the man in...
By the Hebrew, the Mishugah.
Yeah, exactly. The Mishugah.
Michigan.
Yeah, the Michigan.
Does it say that in Hebrew?
Yeah, Mishugah. That's where the Yiddish word comes from.
That's where it gets a Hebrew word.
Yeah.
You know the man and his ranting. You're lying, they said. Tell us the truth. Then he replied, thus and thus, he said. Thus said the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. Quickly, each man took his cloak and placed it under him on the top step. They sounded the horn and proclaimed, Jehu is king. Thus Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram.
Evidently, Jehu's comrades were decided to go with him. And what happens is that Joram is executed. If you go to verse 21, he tries to run away. Jehu, on 797, same chapter, Jehu kills Joram with an arrow. And then they basically go, there's a bloodbath. They kill off all of the descendants of Ahab. And if you turn over the page to verse 30, Jezebel hears about what happened. She gets herself nicely made up and dressed. Evidently, you know, the queen mother is still around. Ahab is dead, but Joram, her son, was king. And anyway, he basically... they threw her from the second floor, and they trample her. In other words, the prophecy about her comes to pass. Okay, so this is a coup d'état, initiated by the Yud He Vav He First Party.
But they
right?
buried her. They didn't leave the...
Yeah, that's true. They wanted to bury her, so they just...
Parts of her body.
Yeah, parts of her body. They just threw it out, you know, somewhere. The point is, this is an attempt to reverse what had been going on, to be instigated by Ahab and Jezebel, which was essentially to turn Samaria into a state that worshipped the same God as the Phoenicians. And evidently there was enough support amongst the army and other people that it worked. Okay? Okay.
So scholars don't, I mean, I guess anybody can interpret this anyway, but scholars don't take this as like, you know, Yehu's people won, so they write the history and they're going to say,
yeah, well, you know, it's
he
possible.
was anointed as one of the Lord, and the other guy was a idol worshiper.
It's possible. The problem with the stories of Elijah and Elisha is you don't know for sure, but it seems to be the evidence that this whole transformation begins in the north with a reaction against Ahab and Jezebel. If you go,
we don't have our real archaeology.
No, we don't.
Stuff we don't know.
No.
So, Rabbi, summarize 2 Kings 9.
Well, what
There's a coup. God said to the Meshuggah to go and anoint.
Well, he says it to Elisha. Then Elisha appoints this guy, appoints one of his disciples to go and do the act.
And he incites rebellion, and the rebellion gets cut down.
No. They cut down the king. They kill the king. They kill the queen mother, and Jehu becomes king and founds a new dynasty.
Oh, that's going to happen.
Yeah, no, it happened. It happened. He kills Joram. All right, that's happened. That happens now.
So he goes from being a Meshuggah to everyone accepts.
No. The disciple, the prophet, they are disparaging him by calling him a Meshuggah, but that shows you the flavor of the story. Anyway, look at chapter 10, verse 18. So Jehu basically consolidates his rule. And then look what happens in...
Well, I guess what I meant by that is this prophet had a lot of sway on people.
Elisha, the guy who did the thing, was his disciple. Yes, Elisha was obviously part of a larger group of people. That's the point. He had really disciples.
Yes.
Yeah. And evidently, a lot of people must have not liked Ahab. And although, from archaeological remains, Ahab actually did a lot in terms of building and all kinds of things. But we do know that he did submit as a vassal king to the Assyrians. Okay? Because the Assyrians, we have a text of that. The house of Omri is one of the vassal kings of Assyria. That's how Ahab survived, basically. And also it was a way to defeat his enemy, the Arameans, by, bringing the Assyrians in. Somewhat. Okay, so look what happens in verse 18. Robert, you want to read this on page 800?
Jehu assembled all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal little. Jehu shall serve him much. Therefore summon to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers, and all his priests. Let no one fail to come, for I am going to hold a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever fails to come shall forfeit his life. Jehu will act with guile in order to exterminate the worshippers of Baal. Jehu will act with guile in order to exterminate the worshippers of Baal. Jehu gave orders to convoke a solemn assembly for Baal, and one was proclaimed. Jehu sent word throughout Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came. Not a single one remained behind. They all came to the temple of Baal, and the temple of Baal was filled from end to end. He said to the man in charge of the wardrobe, bring out the vestments for all the worshippers of Baal, and he brought vestments out for them. Then Jehu and Jehonadab, son of Rechab, came into the temple of Baal, and they said to the worshippers of Baal, search and make sure there are no worshippers of the Lord amongst you, but only worshippers of Baal. Boy, is he setting them up.
Yep.
So
well, you know, we don't have to go further, but the point is he kills them all, and they pull down the entire temple and turn it into latrines. I mean, that's the ultimate thing, the way you desecrate a enemy's holy site is, one, to put dead bones in it, right, and to turn it into a latrine.
Thus Jehu eradicated the Baal from Israel.
Yes, but read the next verse. However,
Jehu did not turn away from the sinful objects by which Jeroboam son of Nebat had caused Israel to sin, namely the golden calves at Bethel and at Dan,
which were shrines to God. Okay? They were ancient shrines to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. The editors of this say, okay, he did a good thing, but he didn't do enough. He didn't shut down the local shrines. The editors of this are all about not just eradicating foreign worship, idol worship, but shutting down the local shrines. Anybody who doesn't do it is not really that good a king in their eyes.
Are these postscripts?
Yeah, of course. No, they're all no.
They're done, and then someone comes along and says,
what it is?
You didn't do this.
No, they're working from a variety of sources, so they're editing it all together and including their editorial. It's deeply embedded. In other words, there was a document called the Annals of the Kings of Israel. There was a document called the Annals of the Kings of Judah. There was definitely probably temple documents from the temple in Jerusalem, and there were some other sources as well, as probably folk tales, and they just pulled them all together and shaped them to in their particular. So it's not all these events are somewhat tentative, but nonetheless they probably to a certain extent reflect actually what was going on. There's a reaction against Ahab.
So it sounds like there's a bit of history, and they have taken this and overlaid it with their whole interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Theology.
This is their later. Absolutely. So
somewhere in there, probably there is some history.
Yep. Okay. So now we're going to move to the 8th century BCE and look at 2 Kings chapter 14. Look at from verse 23 on page 810. This is the reign of Jeroboam II, who was the longest reigning king in the north. He reigned for 41 years. And notice what it says. He did what was displeasing to the Lord. 24. He did what was displeasing to the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins that Jeroboam said. So in other words, he didn't shut down the local shrines. But then notice it was, he expands the territory in Israel. Okay, this is showing that under Jeroboam II, the northern kingdom reaches its largest territorial. And notice in verse 27, and the Lord resolved not to blot out the name of Israel from under heaven. So in other words, here it is. Here's a guy who didn't follow the stricter monotheism, but he flourished, and it was because God decided to let God's mercy. Okay, so that's Jeroboam II, and it's really under him that that the prophets, what we call the literary prophets, are really first recorded.
So is he saying under Jeroboam he did a good job restoring the territory? Because
God let him. Okay. Now, if you take a look in chapter 15, it then talks about Araziah of Judah. Okay. And notice he, in verse 4, this is on page 811, he says, the shrines were not moved, the people continued to sacrifice and make offerings, so he gets leprosy, and his son, basically, they co-rule until he dies, okay? And then, so here it is, after Jeroboam dies, his son is only king for 6 months, and then along comes another coup, and then along comes another coup. In other words, what follows is, you know, this guy Shalom only reigns for a month, and then this guy Menachem comes in and kills him, Menachem reigned for 10 years, and again he continues not to do the sin. And then in verse 19 on page 811 it says, King Pul of 812, verse 19, King Pul of Assyria came, invaded the land, and Menachem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver that he might support him and strengthen his hold in the kingdom. Who is Pul? That is Tiglath-Pileser III, who after a short period of, you'll notice in the list I gave you, Adat Ninari III reigned from 811 to 783. There was a period of political instability. Tiglath-Pileser III did not come from the ruling dynasty. He took over, and he begins a period of very large imperial expansion. So Tiglath-Pileser III comes into the area, and Menachem basically pays him off and becomes a vassal, right? So Tiglath-Pileser III leaves. And then Menachem's son takes over. He continues to, but then his aide, Pekah, kills him. Okay? So what happens if you look on page 813, it talks about how in those days, King Pekah of Israel, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came and captured. In other words, there's a complete invasion. And this is where the kingdom is basically reduced to a vassal state. It's not destroyed yet. It's reduced to a vassal state. If you go to chapter 17, the final king of Israel is this guy Hoshea, son of Elah. And he, of course, does do it. And then you have King Shalmaneser coming. And Hoshea gave his vassal. But then, this is 17, just chapter 17. Anyway, the point is that this is the chapter of the destruction of the northern kingdom.
How do the kings become kings? I mean, what was the process?
Well, there were in the north. It seemed like, you know, most of the time it was a military coup.
Just took over.
Yeah, exactly. It was a coup d'état, and you assassinated the previous guy. I mean, you know, there were some dynasties like the Omri lasted 4 generations, and Jeroboam II's son took over. But after that, it was like, you know, whoever could. I mean, that's one of the problems of the north was they never had a ruling dynasty that remained stable like the south.
So what happens to the Roman Empire?
Well, yeah. Okay. So what happens is that you have here that Shalmaneser marches against him. We're on page 816. Now, we know that Shalmaneser didn't complete the destruction of the north. He died, and it was Sargon II who did it. We know this from the Assyrian court. We have from the Assyrian chronicles that we have and inscriptions. The point is, take a look what happens in verse 6.
In the 9th year?
Yeah.
In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Hala, at the river harbor, at the river Gozan, and in the towns of Media. This happened because the Israelites sinned against the Lord their God, who had freed them from the land of Egypt and the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the customs of the nation which the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and the customs which the kings of Israel had practiced. The Israelites committed against the Lord their God acts which were not right. They built for themselves shrines in all their settlements, from watchtowers to fortified cities. They set up pillars and sacred posts for themselves on every lofty hill and under every leafy tree, and they offered sacrifices there at all the shrines like the nations whom the Lord had driven into exile before.
Notice that? They acted like the Canaanites.
In that they set up these sacrifices.
Yeah, so far we're not talking about here worship of foreign gods here.
They committed wicked acts to vex the Lord, and they worshipped fetishes, concerning which the Lord had said to them, You must not do this thing.
Okay, and then if you take a look down, if you go down to verse, it talks about again. They got the prophets warned them, right? Verse 13. It goes on. They rejected from them. They made idols. They practiced, augury. They did all kinds of things. And now, if you go, we don't have to read it all. If you go to verse 24. This is where it talks about how the Assyrians brought in all these other people and settled them. And at first it says they didn't worship the Lord, and they're in the Lord's land, and they don't worship him, so the Lord sent lions against them. Anyway, so the point is, what you have here is the setting up of a synchronistic worship here. Okay? And if you go down to the bottom of page 819, it talks about how they continued their former practices. Those nations worship the Lord, but they also serve their idols. To this day, their children and their children's children do as their ancestors did. This is an attack on the Samaritans. Okay? So here it is. That's the end of the northern kingdom. And you see that the Deuteronomic historian says this is the reason why the north was destroyed. And evidently, that's what a lot of people in the north interpreted the destruction of the
temple. It wasn't the worship of Baal, it was simply the type of worship, the way they worship.
Yeah, it was hinting also in the fetishes. The point is, it was not right. It was just not authentic worship, because the Deuteronomic people who edited this say there's only one place where there should be a sacrifice. The original Jeroboam committed a great sin when he built the shrines at Bethel and Dan, which is not true. They were already there. The point is, they have to blame somebody for this. This is against the idea of the local shrines and the decentralization. Why? Because it ends up with fetishes and worshiping other gods and things like that. So that's the Book of Kings. So let's
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
However, when these people came into Syria, into Israel.
Yeah, the foreigners.
They were foreigners, and they didn't do so well. God sent these lions against them.
Right.
It says, the nations which you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know the rules of the God of the land.
Right.
It makes the God sound like a very local God.
Exactly.
But this is God.
Exactly. They were acting like, well, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is just the local God, so we got to worship the local God, otherwise he's going to be angry with us. But the editors are saying, they really don't know what the heck they were doing, So, before we finish, let's just... I've given you 3 of the prophets. We're going to look at... I left Micah out, but because he's very hard to date. But the 2 critical prophets, the 2 northern prophets, during the latter part of the reign of Jeroboam II, until almost the destruction of the north, are Amos and Hosea. Right? Amos does refer to some of the political events. Hosea does not. It's very hard to date what Hosea is saying, but it's pretty evident what he's talking about nonetheless. So just before we leave, go to the beginning of the book of Amos, because all these books, a lot of these books anyway, tend to have a title verse. The very first verse is a title that tells you when they prophesied. Not when they lived, when they prophesied. Okay? Amos. Amos is the earlier one. It's on 1309. Now, what's interesting is Amos is a Judean who goes north to prophesy. Hosea is a northerner. Look what it says. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa, who prophesied concerning Israel, notice, not Judah, in the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. There evidently was a serious earthquake in Israel around that time that's referred to in the book of Zechariah. And Amos, he did his whole activity in the north. But notice, he doesn't come from a prophetic band. He does not connected with a shrine. He doesn't come from a court. He's a guy who's this sheep breeder who gets hit with the Spirit of God, and he begins to prophesy. And Amos is basically telling the north, you blew it, destruction is coming, there's nothing you can do about it. All right? Essentially, that's what his message to the north. You idiots, you blew it. And we'll start looking at it. We'll look at his prophecies. One of the interesting things, of course, is that a lot of his attacks, of course, are based also on the injustices that are occurring during the reign of Jeroboam II, because what happened when the economy expanded? Here's a modern theme. There was a lot of income inequality during the time of Jeroboam II. Seriously, an oppression by the rich of the poor. So, one of the things you're going to find with Amos...
prophet coming.
Yeah, exactly. Amos is going to connect
Well, isn't
up.
that his point that this has always been going on?
Right. You see, the critical point is that...
consequences.
You see, the critical point of Amos and Hosea and Isaiah, for example, is they connect up immorality and unethical behavior with, not being proper worship and belief in God. In other words, to them, it's all part of the same thing.
Amos does it.
Amos does it. Hosea does it too, and so does Isaiah. All right? That's one of the things.
Connecting what to what?
Unrighteousness, injustice is part of their message. You can't separate it from the rest of the messages. You're worshiping at these shrines. This is a big mistake. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is the only God, and you have to. There's only one place to worship him. Amos is part of the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh first party.
But you're saying they add this whole other...
The moral part.
Well, prophets always did that. I mean, that's the point. That was one of the roles of the prophet, was to be a social critic. So for him, you have to understand it's not separate messages. It's all part of the same message. They link it together. They link idol worship with violence and murder and sexual crimes and oppression of the poor. Because if you had the proper respect for God and followed God's covenant, you wouldn't do those things. Right?
And we're going to be studying this next week?
Yeah, well, just before you go, take a look briefly at one of the prophecies. Again, these books are not written by the prophets. They're written by people. The prophets gave these things orally. They're written down by their disciples, some kind of secretaries. They're edited together, sometimes consistently, sometimes not. The structures of these books are incredibly complex. But take a look in chapter 2, just to give you a flavor of this. Verse 6. We're on page 1311. Sam, you want to read it?
Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, the 4 I will not revoke.
That 3-4 thing was a very typical kind of poetic form you find in the book of Proverbs. Verse 6. Verse 6.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Because they have sold.
Because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. You who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground, and make the humble walk with a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl.
Meaning they go to the same prostitute.
And thereby profane my holy name. They recline by every altar on garments taken in pledge, and drink in the house of their God.
He's not talking about the temple of Jerusalem. He's talking about a local temple here.
Wine brought with fines they imposed. Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose stature was like the cedars, and who was stout as the oak, destroying his boughs above and his trunk below. And I brought you up from the land of Egypt and led you through the wilderness 40 years to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up prophets from among your sons and Nazarites from among your young men. Is that not so, O people of Israel?
That's the prophecy. That's a distinct prophecy, says the Lord. That's sort of the footnote, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, notice, I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I kicked out the Canaanites before you, who were really strong people. And look what you've done. You're worshiping at every altar. You're bringing these horrible things into your temples. Mm-hmm. You're doing this immorality, sexual immorality, oppressing the poor. Look what I did for you. I raised up prophets and Nazarites, holy men, among your sons. Is that not right? I mean, that's the challenging question. So this is a typical example of Amos's critique, right? Which we're going to look at a few more examples, and then we'll look at Hosea, which he does it in a really different way. And he, by the way, Hosea actually opens the possibility of repentance. That's the interesting thing about the Deuteronomic school, is they introduce the idea of repentance and return. There's no return in Amos. And some of these early prophets, like Amos, like Hosea, and like Micah, their work is known to the later prophets like Jeremiah. And we usually have some quotes in Jeremiah from
Interesting,
prophet
they put it
Micah.
is it Vayeshev? I'm looking which parasha is this Haftarah for?
Oh, I forget which
I think
Haftarah.
Vayeshev,
Yeah,
because
probably.
of the sandals, the selling for
Right,
silver.
exactly, which is connected
Which
to
is
the
the
story of
Joseph.
Joseph.
Joseph's
Yeah.
The point is, if you want to read
That's what
on
I'm
some of the other prophecies, again, I've just given you a taste of a few of them, and we'll continue next week.
Rabbi, as a total